Chapter 1. I wakened with a start, and thought, how was Caldwell taking it? I must have moved physically, for blackness edged with pain closed over me. How long I lay in that agonized faint, I have no means of knowing. My next awareness was of the thrusting of the engines that drove the spaceship. Slowly this time, consciousness returned. I lay very quiet, feeling the weight of my years of sleep, determined to follow the routine prescribed so long ago by Pelham. I didn't want to faint again. I lay there, and I thought, it was silly to have worried about Jim Caldwell. He wasn't due to come out of his state of suspended animation for another 50 years. I began to watch the illuminated face of the clock in the ceiling. It had registered 23:12, now it was 23:22. The 10 minutes Pelham had suggested for a time lapse between passivity and initial action was up. Slowly. I pushed my hand toward the edge of the bed. Click. My fingers pressed the button that was there. There was a faint hum. The automatic massager began to fumble gently over my naked form. First, it rubbed my arms, then it moved to my legs, and so on over my body. As it progressed, I could feel the fine slick of oil that oozed from it working into my dry skin. A dozen times I could have screamed from the pain of life returning. But in an hour I was able to sit up and turn on the lights. The small, sparsely furnished, familiar room couldn't hold my attention for more than an instant. I stood up. The movement must have been too abrupt. I swayed, caught onto the metal column of the bed, and retched discolored stomach juices. The nausea passed. But it required an effort of will for me to walk to the door, open it, and head along the narrow corridor that led to the control room. I wasn't supposed to so much as pause there, but a spasm of absolutely dreadful fascination seized me, and I couldn't help it. I leaned over the control chair, and glanced at the chronometer. It said, 53 years, 7 months, 2 weeks. 0 days, 0 hours and 27 minutes. 53 years. A little blindly, almost blankly, rack on earth, the people we had known, the young men we'd gone to college with, that girl who had kissed me at the party given us the night we left, they were all dead. Or dying of old age. One remembered the girl very vividly. She was pretty, vivacious, a complete stranger. She had laughed as she offered her red lips, and she had said a kiss for the ugly one, too. She'd be a grandmother now, or in her grave. Tears came to my eyes. I brushed them away, and began to heat the can of concentrated liquid that was to be my first food. Slowly, my mind calmed. 53 years and 7½ months, I thought drably. Nearly 4 years over my allotted time. I'd have to do some figuring before I took another dose of eternity drug. 20 grains had been calculated to preserve my flesh and my life for exactly 50 years. The stuff was evidently more potent than Pelham had been able to estimate from his short-period advanced tests. I sat tense, narrow-eyed, thinking about that. Abrupt consciousness came of what I was doing. Laughter spat from lips. The sound split the silence like a series of pistol shots, startled me. But it also relieved me. Was I sitting here actually being critical? A miss of only 4 years was bullseye across that span of years. Why, I was alive and still young. Time and space had been conquered. The universe belonged to man. I ate my soup, sipping each spoonful deliberately. I made the bowl last every second of 30 minutes. Then, greatly refreshed, I made my way back to the control room. This time I paused for a long look through the plates. It took only a few moments to locate Sol, a very brightly glowing star in the approximate center of the rearview plate. Alpha Centauri required longer to locate. But it shone finally, a glow point in a light-sprinkled darkness. I wasted no time trying to estimate their distances. They looked right. In 54 years we had covered approximately 1/10 of the 4 1/3 light years to the famous nearest star system. Satisfied, I threaded my way back to the living quarters. Take them in a row, I thought. Pelham first. As I opened the airtight door of Pelham's room, a sickening odor of decayed flesh tingled in my nostrils. With a gasp I slammed the door, stood there in the narrow hallway, shuddering. After a minute, there was still nothing but the reality. Pelham was dead. I cannot clearly remember what I did then. One ran, I know that. I flung open Caldwell's door, then Blake's. The clean, sweet smell of their rooms, the sight of their silent bodies on their beds brought back a measure of my sanity. A great sadness came to me. Poor, brave Pelham. Inventor of the eternity drug that had made the great plunge into interstellar space possible, he lay dead now from his own invention. What was it he had said? The chances are greatly against any of us dying. But there's what I am calling a death factor of about 10%, a byproduct of the first dose. If our bodies survive the initial shock, they will survive additional doses. The death factor must be greater than 10%. That extra 4 years the drug had kept me asleep. Gloomily, I went to the storeroom, and procured my personal spacesuit and a tarpaulin. But even with their help, it was a horrible business. The drug had preserved the body to some extent, but pieces kept falling off as I lifted it. At last, I carried the tarpaulin and its contents to the airlock, and shoved it into space. I felt pressed now for time. These waking periods were to be brief affairs, in which what we called the current oxygen was to be used up, but the main reserves were not to be touched. Chemicals in each room slowly refreshed the current air over the years, readying it for the next to awaken. In some curious defensive fashion, we had neglected to allow for an emergency like the death of one of our members. Even as I climbed out of the spacesuit, I could feel the difference in the air I was breathing. I went first to the radio. It had been calculated that half a light year was the limit of radio reception, and we were approaching that limit. Now, hurriedly, though carefully, I wrote my report out, then read it into a transcription record, and started sending. I set the record to repeat 100 times. In a little more than 5 months hence, headlines would be flaring on Earth. I clamped my written report into the ship log book, and added a note for Caldwell at the bottom. It was a brief tribute to Pelham. My praise was heartfelt, but there was another reason behind my note. They had been pals, Caldwell, the engineering genius who built the ship, and Pelham, the great chemist-doctor, whose eternity drug had made it possible for men to take this fantastic journey into vastness. It seemed to me that Caldwell, waking up into the great silence of the hurtling ship, would need my tribute to his friend and colleague. It was little enough for me to do, who loved them both. The note written. I hastily examined the glowing engines, made notations of several instrument readings, and then counted out 55 grains of eternity drug. That was as close as I could get to the amount I felt would be required for 150 years. For a long moment before sleep came, I thought of Caldwell and the terrible shock that was coming to him on top of all the natural reactions to his situations, that would strike deep into his peculiar, sensitive nature. I stirred uneasily at the picture. The worry was still in my mind when darkness came. Almost instantly, I opened my eyes. I lay thinking, the drug. It hadn't worked. The draggy feel of my body warned me of the truth. I lay very still watching the clock overhead. This time it was easier to follow the routine, except that, once more, I could not refrain from examining the chronometer as I passed through the galley. It read, 201 years. 1 month, 3 weeks, 5 days, 7 hours, 8 minutes. I slipped my bowl of that super soup, then went eagerly to the big log book. It is utterly impossible for me to describe the thrill that coursed through me, as I saw the familiar handwriting of Verlake, and then, as I turned back the pages, of Caldwell. My excitement drained slowly, as I read what Caldwell had written. It was a report, nothing more, gravimetric readings, a careful calculation of the distance covered, a detailed report on the performance of the engines, and, finally, an estimate of our speed variations, based on the 7 consistent factors. It was a splendid mathematical job, a first-rate scientific analysis. But that was all there was. No mention of Pelham, not a word of comment on what I had written or on what had happened. Caldwell had wakened, and, if his report was any criterion, he might as well have been a robot. I knew better than that. So, I saw as I began to read Blake's report, did Blake, Bill, tear this sheet out when you've read IT? Well, the worst has happened. We couldn't have asked fate to give us an unkind kick in the pants. I hate to think of Pelham being dead, what a man he was, what a friend, but we all knew the risk we were taking, he more than any of us. Space rest his great soul. But Caldwell's case is now serious. After all, we were worried, wondering how he'd take his first awakening, let alone a bang between the eyes like Pelham's death. And I think that first anxiety was justified. As you and I have always known, Caldwell was one of Earth's fair-haired boys. Just imagine any one human being born with his combination of looks, money and intelligence. His great fault was that he never let the future trouble him. With that dazzling personality of his, and the crew of worshipping women and yes-men around him, he didn't have much time for anything but the present. Realities always struck him like a thunderbolt. He could leave those 3 ex-wives of his, and they weren't so ex. If you ask me, without grasping that it was forever. That goodbye party was enough to put anyone into a sort of mental haze when it came to realities. To wake up 100 years later and realize that those he loved had withered, died, and been eaten by worms. I put it baldly like that because the human mind always thinks of the worst angles, no matter how it censors speech. I personally counted on Pelham acting as a sort of psychological support to Caldwell, and we both know that Pelham recognized the extent of his influence over Caldwell. That influence must be replaced. Try to think of something, Bill, while you're charging around doing the routine work. We've got to live with that guy after we all wake up at the end of the 500 years. Tear out this sheet. What follows is routine. Net. I burned the letter in the incinerator, examined the two sleeping bodies, how deathly quiet they lay, and then returned to the control room. In the plate, the sun was a very bright star, a jewel set in black velvet, a gorgeous, shining brilliant. Alpha Centauri was brighter. It was a radiant light in that panoply of black and glitter. It was still impossible to make out the separate suns of Alpha A, B, C and Proxima, but their combined light brought a sense of awe and majesty. Excitement blazed inside me, and consciousness came of the glory of this trip we were making, the first men to head for far Centaurus, the first men to dare aspire to the stars. Even the thought of Earth failed to dim that surging tide of wonder, the thought that 7, possibly 8 generations, had been born since our departure, the thought that the girl who had given me the sweet remembrance of her red lips was now known to her descendants as their great-great-great-great-grandmother, if she was remembered at all. The immense time involved, the whole idea, was too meaningless for emotion. I did my work, took my third dose of the drug, and went to bed. The sleep found me still without a plan about Caldwell. When I woke up, alarm bells were ringing. I lay still. There was nothing else to do. If I had moved, consciousness would have slid from me. Though it was mental torture even to think it. I realized that, no matter what the danger, the quickest way was to follow my routine to the second and in every detail. Somehow I did it. The bells clanged and burred. But I lay there until it was time to get up. The clamor was hideous, as I passed through the control room. But I passed through, and sat for half an hour sipping my soup. The conviction came to me that if that sound continued much longer, Blake and Caldwell would surely waken from their sleep. At last, I felt free to cope with the emergency. Breathing hard, I eased myself into the control chair, cut off the mind-wrecking alarms, and switched on the plates. A fire glowed at me from the rear-view plate. It was a colossal white fire, longer than it was wide, and filling nearly a quarter of the whole sky. The hideous thought came to me that we must be within a few million miles of some monstrous sun that had recently roared into this part of space. Frantically, I manipulated the distance estimators, and then for a moment stared in blank disbelief at the answers that clicked metallically onto the product plate. 7 miles. Only 7 miles. Curious is the human mind. A moment before, when I had thought of it as an abnormally shaped sun, it hadn't resembled anything but an incandescent mass. Abruptly, now, I saw that it had a solid outline, an unmistakable material shape. Stunned, I leapt to my feet because it was a spaceship. An enormous, mile-long ship. Rather, I sank back into my seat, subdued by the catastrophe Elle was witnessing, and consciously adjusting my mind, the flaming hell of what had been a spaceship. Nothing that had been alive could possibly still be conscious in that horror of ravenous fire. The only possibility was that the crew had succeeded in launching lifeboats. Like a madman, I searched the heavens for a light, a glint of metal that would show the presence of survivors. There was nothing but the night and the stars and the hell of burning ship. After a long time, I noticed that it was farther away, and seemed to be receding. Whatever drive forces had matched its velocity to ours must be yielding to the fury of the energies that were consuming the ship. I began to take pictures, and I felt justified in turning on the oxygen reserves. As it withdrew into distance, the miniature nova that had been a torpedo-shaped space liner began to change color, to lose its white intensity. It became a red fire silhouetted against darkness. My last glimpse showed it as a long, dull glow that looked like nothing else than a cherry-colored nebula seen edge-on, like a blaze reflecting from the night beyond a far horizon. I had already, in between observations, done everything else required of me, and now, I reconnected the alarm system and, very reluctantly, my mind seething with speculation, returned to bed. As I lay waiting for my final dosage of the trip to take effect, I thought, the great star system of Alpha Centauri must have inhabited planets. If my calculations were correct, we were only 1.6 light-years from the main Alpha group of suns, slightly nearer than that to Red Proxima. Here was proof that the universe had at least one other supremely intelligent race. Wonders beyond our wildest expectations were in store for us. Thrill on thrill of anticipation raced through me. It was only at the last instant, as sleep was already grasping at my brain, that the realization struck that I had completely forgotten about the problem of Caldwell. I felt no alarm. Surely, even Caldwell would come alive in that great fashion of his when confronted by a complex alien civilization. Our troubles were over. Excitement must have bridged that final 150 years of time. Because, when I wakened, I thought, we're here. It's over, the long night, the incredible journey. We'll all be waking, seeing each other, as well as the civilization out there. Seeing, too, the great Centauri suns. The strange thing, it struck me as I lay there exulting, was that the time seemed long. And yet I had been awake only 3 times, and only once for the equivalent of a full day. In the truest sense of meaning, I had seen Blake and Caldwell, and Pelham, no more than a day and a half ago. I had had only 36 hours of consciousness since a pair of soft lips had set themselves against mine, and clung in the sweetest kiss of my life. Then why this feeling that millenniums had ticked by, second on slow second? Why this eerie, empty awareness of a journey through fathomless, unending night? Was the human mind so easily fooled? It seemed to me, finally, that the answer was that one had been alive for those 500 years, all my cells and my organs had existed, and it was not even impossible that some part of my brain had been horrendously aware throughout the entire unthinkable period. And there was, of course, the additional psychological fact that I knew now that 500 years had gone by, and that I saw with a mental start that my 10 minutes were up. Cautiously, I turned on the massager. The gentle, padded hands had been working on me for about 15 minutes when my door opened, the light clicked on. And there stood Blake. The too sharp movement of turning my head to look at him made me dizzy. I closed my eaves, and heard him walk across the room toward me. After a minute, I was able to look at him again without seeing blurs. I saw then that he was carrying a bowl of the soup. He stood staring down at me with a strangely grim expression on his face. At last, his long, thin countenance relaxed into a wan grin. "Lo, Bill," he said. She hissed immediately. "Now, don't try to speak. I'm going to start feeding you this soup while you're still lying down. The sooner you're up, the better I'll like it." He was grim again, as he finished almost as if it was an afterthought. "I've been up for 2 weeks." He sat down on the edge of the bed, and ladled out a spoonful of soup. There was silence, then, except for the rustling sound of the massager. Slowly, the strength flowed through my body, and with each passing second, I became more aware of the grimness of Blake. "What about Caldwell?" I managed finally, hoarsely. "He awake?" Blake hesitated, then nodded. His expression darkened with frown. He said simply, "He's mad, Bill, stark, staring mad. I had to tie him up. I've got him now in his room. He's quieter now. But at the beginning he was a gibbering maniac." "Are you crazy?" I whispered at last. Caldwell was never so sensitive as that. Depressed and sick, yes, but the mere passage of time, abrupt awareness that all his friends are dead, couldn't make him insane. Blake was shaking his head. "It isn't only that. Bill." He paused, then, "Bill, I want you to prepare your mind for the greatest shock it's ever had." I stared up at him with an empty feeling inside me. "What do you mean?" He went on, grimacing, "I know you'll be able to take it. So don't get scared. You and I, Bill, are just a couple of lugs. We're along because we went to you with Caldwell and Pelham. Basically, it wouldn't matter to insensitive chaps like us whether we landed in 1.000,000 B, C, or AD. We just look around and say, 'Fancy seeing you here, mug.' Or 'Who was that pterodactyl I saw you with last night?' That wasn't no pterodactyl, that was his bulbous-brained wife." "For Mars' sake," I whispered, "get to the point. What's up?" Blake rose to his feet. "Bill, after I'd read your reports about and seen the photographs of that burning ship, I got an idea. The Alpha Suns were pretty close 2 weeks ago, only about 6 months away at our average speed of 500 miles a second. I thought to myself, I'll see if I can tune in some of their radio stations. Well," he smiled wryly, "I got hundreds in a few minutes. They came in all over the 7-wave dials, with bell-like clarity. He paused, he stared down at me, and his smile was a sickly thing. "Bill," he groaned, "we're the prize fools in creation." When I told Caldwell the truth, he folded up like ice melting into water. Once more, he paused. The silence was too much for my straining nerves. "For heaven's sake, man," I began. And stopped. And lay there, very still. Just like that, the lightning of understanding flashed on me. My blood seemed to thunder through my veins. At last, weakly, I said, "You mean?" Blake nodded. "Yeah," he said. "That's the way it is. And they've already spotted us with their spy rays and energy screens. A ship's coming out to meet us. I only hope," he finished gloomily, "they can do something for Jim." I was sitting in the control chair an hour later when I saw the glint in the darkness. There was a flash of bright silver that exploded into size. The next instant, an enormous spaceship had matched our velocity less than a mile away. Blake and I looked at each other. "Did they say," I said shakily, that ship left its hangar 10 minutes ago?" Blake nodded. "They can make the trip from Earth to Centauri in 3 hours," he said. I hadn't heard that before. Something happened inside my brain. "What?" I shouted. "Why, it's taken us 500 years." I stopped. I sat there. 3 hours, I whispered. How could we have forgotten human progress? In the silence that fell then, we watched a dark hole open in the cliff-like wall that faced us. Into this cavern, I directed our ship. The rear view plate showed that the cave entrance was closing. Ahead of us lights flashed on, and focused on a door. As I eased our craft to the metal floor, a face flickered onto our radio plate. "Casellahat," Blake whispered in my ear. "The only chap who's talked direct to me so far." It was a distinguished, a scholarly-looking head and face that peered at us. Casellahat smiled, and said, "You may leave your ship, and go through the door you see." I had a sense of empty spaces around us, as we climbed gingerly out into the vast receptor chamber. Interplanetary spaceship hangars were like that, I reminded myself. Only this one had an alien quality that nerves. I thought sharply. But I could see that Blake felt it, too. A silent duo, we filed through the doorway into a hallway that opened into a very large, luxurious room. It was such a room as a king or a movie actress on set might have walked into without blinking. It was all hung with gorgeous tapestries, that is, for a moment, I thought they were tapestries, then I saw they weren't. They were. I couldn't decide. I had seen expensive furniture in some of the apartments Caldwell maintained. But these Chesterfields, chairs and tables glittered at us, as if they were made of a matching design of differently colored fires. No, that was wrong, they didn't glitter at all. They. Once more I couldn't decide. I had no time for more detailed examination. For a man arrayed very much as we were, was rising from one of the chairs. I recognized Casellahat. He came forward, smiling. Then he slowed, his nose wrinkling. A moment later, he hastily shook our hands, then swiftly retreated to a chair 10 feet away, and sat down rather primly. It was an astoundingly ungracious performance. But I was glad that he had drawn back that way. Because, as he shook my hand so briefly, I had caught a faint whiff of perfume from him. It was a vaguely unpleasant odor, and, besides, a man using perfume in quantities. I shuddered. What kind of foppish nonsense had the human race gone in for? He was motioning us to sit down. I did so, wondering, was this our reception? The erstwhile radio operator began. "About your friend, I must caution you. He is a schizoid type, and our psychologists will be able to effect a temporary recovery only for the moment. A permanent cure will require a longer period, and your fullest cooperation. Fall in readily with all Mr. Caldwell's plans, unless, of course, he takes a dangerous turn. But now," he squirted us a smile, "permit me to welcome you to the 4 planets of Centauri. It is a great moment for me, personally. From early childhood, I have been trained for the sole purpose of being your mentor and guide, and naturally I am overjoyed that the time has come when my exhaustive studies of the Middle Period American language and customs can be put to the practical use for which they were intended." He didn't look overjoyed. He was wrinkling his nose in that funny way I had already noticed, and there was a generally pained expression on his face. But it was his words that shocked me. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Studies in American? Don't people speak the universal language anymore?" "Of course," he smiled, "but the language has developed to a point where, I might as well be frank, you would have difficulty understanding such a simple word as yeah." "Yeah?" Blake echoed. Meaning yes. Oh. We sat silent, Blake chewing his lower lip. It was Blake who finally said, "What kind of places are the Centauri planets? You said something on the radio about the population centers having reverted to the city structure again." "I shall be happy," said Castellahat, "to show you as many of our great cities as you care to see. You are our guests, and several million credits have been placed to your separate accounts for you to use as you see fit." "Gee," said Blake. "I must, however," Castellahat went on, "give you a warning. It is important that you do not disillusion our peoples about yourselves. Therefore, you must never wander around the streets, or mingle with the crowds in any way. Always. Your contact should be via newsreels, radio, or from the inside of a closed machine. If you have any plan to marry, you must now finally give up the idea." "I don't get it," Blake said wonderingly, and he spoke for us both. Castellahat finished firmly, "It is important that no one becomes aware that you have an offensive physical odor. It might damage your financial prospects considerably. And now," he stood up, "for the time being, I shall leave you. I hope you don't mind if I wear a mask in future in your presence. I wish you well, gentlemen, and—" He paused, glanced past us, said, "Ah, here is your friend." I whirled, and I could see Blake twisting, staring. "Hi, there, fellows," Caldwell said cheerfully from the door, then wryly, "Have we ever been a bunch of suckers?" I felt choked. I raced up to him, caught his hand, hugged him. Blake was trying to do the same. When we finally released Caldwell, and looked around, Castellahat was gone. Which was just as well. I had been wanting to punch him in the nose for his final remarks. "Well, here goes," Caldwell said. He looked at Blake and me, grinned, rubbed his hands together gleefully, and added, "For a week I've been watching, thinking up questions to ask this cluck N." He faced Castellahat. "What," he began, "makes the speed of light constant?" Castellahat did not even blink. "Velocity equals the cube of the cube root of g over d," he said, d being the depth of the spacetime continuum, g the total toleration or gravity, as you would say, of all the matter in that continuum. How are planets formed? A sun must balance itself in the space that it is in. It throws out matter as a sea vessel does anchors. That's a very rough description. One could give it to you in mathematical formula, but I'd have to write it down. After all, I'm not a scientist. These are merely facts that I've known from childhood, or so it seems. "Just a minute," said Caldwell, puzzled. "A sun throws this matter out without any pressure other than its desire to balance itself?" Castellahat stared at him. "Of course not. The reason, the pressure involved, is very potent, I assure you. Without such a balance, the sun would fall out of this space. Only a few bachelor suns have learned how to maintain stability. Without planets." "A few what?" echoed Caldwell. I could see that he had been jarred into forgetting the questions he had been intending to ask one by swift one. Castellahat's words cut across my thought. He said, "A bachelor sun is a very old, cooled class M star. The hottest one known has a temperature of 190 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest 48. Literally, a bachelor is a rogue, crochet with age. Its main feature is that it permits no matter, no planets, not even gases in its vicinity." Caldwell sat silent, frowning, thoughtful. I seized the opportunity to carry on a train of idea. "This business," I said, "of knowing all this stuff without being a scientist, interests me. For instance, back home every kid understood the atomic rocket principle practically from the day he was born. Boys of 8 and 10 rode around in specially made toys, took them apart and put them together again. They thought rocket atomic, and any new development in the field was just pie for them to absorb. Now, here's what I'd like to know, what is the parallel here to that particular angle?" "The Adelic-Nander force," said Castellahat. "I've already tried to explain it to Mr. Caldwell, but his mind seems to balk at some of the most simple aspects." Caldwell roused himself, grimaced. "He's been trying to tell me that electrons think, and I won't swallow it." Castellahat shook his head. "Not think, they don't think. But they have a psychology." "Electronic psychology," I said. "Simply Adelic-Nander," Castellahat replied. "Any child." Caldwell groaned, "I know. Any child of 6 could tell me." He turned to us. "That's why I lined up a lot of questions. I figured that if we got a good intermediate grounding, we might be able to slip into this Adelic-Nander stuff the way their kids do." He faced Castellahat. "Next question," he said. "What?" Castellahat had been looking at his watch. "I'm afraid, Mr. Caldwell," he interrupted, that if you and I are going to be on the ferry to the Pelham planet, we'd better leave now. You can ask your questions on the way. What's all this? I chimed in. Caldwell explained, he's taking me to the great engineering laboratories in the European mountains of Pelham. Want to come along? Not me, I said. Blake shrugged. I don't fancy getting into one of those suits Caldwells has provided for us, designed to keep our odor in, but not theirs out. He finished, Bill and I will stay here and play poker for some of that 5 million credits worth of dough we've got in the state bank. Caldwells turned at the door. There was a distinct frown on the flesh mask he wore. You treat our government's gift very lightly. Yeah, said Blake. So we stink, said Blake. It was 9 days since Caldwells had taken Caldwell to the planet Pelham, and our only contact had been a radio telephone call from Caldwell on the third day, telling us not to worry. Blake was standing at the window of our penthouse apartment in the city, and I was on my back on a couch, in my mind a mixture of thoughts involving Caldwell's potential insanity and all the things I had heard and seen about the history of the past 500 years. I roused myself. Quit it, I said. We're faced with a change in the metabolism of the human body, probably due to the different foods from remote stars that they eat. They must be able to smell better, too, because just being near us is agony to Caldwell, whereas we only notice an unpleasantness from him. It's a case of 3 of us against billions of them. Frankly, I don't see an early victory over the problem, so let's just take it quietly. There was no answer, so I returned to my reverie. My first radio message to Earth had been picked up, and so, when the interstellar drive was invented in 2320 A.D., less than 140 years after our departure, it was realized what would eventually happen. In our honor, the 4 habitable planets of the Alpha A and B suns were called Caldwell, Pelham, Blake, and Endicott. Since 2320, the populations of the 4 planets had become so dense that a total of 19 billion people now dwelt on their narrowing land spaces. This in spite of migrations to the planets of more distant stars. The space liner I had seen burning in 2511 A.D. was the only ship ever lost on the Earth's Centauri lane. Traveling at full speed, its screens must have reacted against our spaceship. All the automatics would instantly have flashed on, and, as those defenses were notable at that time to stop a ship that had gone minus infinity, every recoil engine aboard had probably blown up. Such a thing could not happen again. So enormous had been the progress in the Adelitignander field of power, that the greatest liners could stop dead in the full fury of mid-flight. We had been told not to feel any sense of blame for that one disaster, as many of the most important advances in Adelitignander electronic psychology had been made as the result of theoretical analyses of that great catastrophe. I grew aware that Blake had flung himself disgustedly into a nearby chair. Boy, oh, boy, he said, this is going to be some life for us. We can all anticipate about 50 more years of being pariahs in a civilization where we can't even understand how the simplest machines work. I stirred uneasily. I had had similar thoughts. But I said nothing. Blake went on. I must admit, after I first discovered the Centauri planets had been colonized, I had pictures of myself bowling over some dame, and marrying her. Involuntarily, my mind leapt to the memory of a pair of lips lifting up to mine. I shook myself. I said. I wonder how Caldwell is taking all this. A familiar voice from the door cut off my words. Caldwell, it said, is taking things beautifully now that the first shock has yielded to resignation, and resignation to purpose. We had turned to face him by the time he finished. Caldwell walked slowly toward us, grinning. Watching him, I felt uncertain as to just how to take his built-up sanity. He was at his best. His dark, wavy hair was perfectly combed. His startling blue eyes made his whole face come alive. He was a natural physical wonder, and at his normal he had all the shine and swagger of an actor in a carefully tailored picture. He wore that shine and swagger now. He said. I've bought a spaceship, fellows. Took all my money and part of yours, too. But I knew you'd back me up. Am I right? Why, sure, Blake and I echoed. Blake went on alone, what's the idea? I get it, I chimed in. We'll cruise all over the universe, live our lifespan exploring new worlds. Jim, you've got something there. Blake and I were just going to enter a suicide pact. Caldwell was smiling. We'll cruise for a while anyway. 2 days later, Caldwell having offered no objection and no advice about Caldwell, we were in space. It was a curious 3 months that followed. For a while I felt a sense of awe at the vastness of the cosmos. Silent planets swung into our viewing plates, and faded into remoteness behind us, leaving nostalgic memory of uninhabited, wind-lashed forests and plains, deserted, swollen seas and nameless suns. The sight and the remembrance brought loneliness like an ache, and the knowledge, the slow knowledge, that this journeying was not lifting the weight of strangeness that had settled upon us ever since our arrival at Alpha Centauri. There was nothing here for our souls to feed on, nothing that would satisfactorily fill 1 year of our life, let alone 50. Nothing, nothing. I watched the realization grow on Blake, and I waited for a sign from Caldwell that he felt it, too. The sign didn't come. That of itself worried me, then I grew aware of something else. Caldwell was watching us. Watching us with a hint in his manner of secret knowledge. A suggestion of secret purpose. My alarm grew and Caldwell's perpetual cheerfulness didn't help any. I was lying on my bunk at the end of the 3rd month, thinking uneasily about the whole unsatisfactory situation, when my door opened, and Caldwell came in. He carried a paralyzer gun and a rope. He pointed the gun at me, and said, "Sorry, Bill. Casella told me to take no chances, so just lie quiet while I tie you up." "Blake," I bellowed. Caldwell shook his head gently. "No use," he said. "I was in his room first." The gun was steady in his fingers, his blue eyes were steely. All I could do was tense my muscles against the ropes as he tied me, and trust to the fact that I was twice as strong, at least, as he was. I thought in dismay, surely I could prevent him from tying me too tightly. He stepped back finally, said again, "Sorry, Bill." He added, "I hate to tell you this, but both of you went off the deep end mentally when we arrived at Centauri, and this is the cure prescribed by the psychologists whom Casella consulted. You're supposed to get a shock as big as the one that knocked you for a loop." The first time I'd paid no attention to his mention of Casella's name. Now my mind flared with understanding. Incredibly, Caldwell had been told that Blake and I were mad. All these months he had been held steady by a sense of responsibility toward us. It was a beautiful psychological scheme. The only thing was, what shock was going to be administered? Caldwell's voice cut off my thought. He said, "It won't be long now. We're already entering the field of the bachelor sun." "Bachelor sun," I yelled. He made no reply. The instant the door closed behind him, I began to work on my bonds. All the time I was thinking. What was it Casella had said? Bachelor suns maintain themselves in this space by a precarious balancing. In this space. The sweat poured down my face, as I pictured ourselves being precipitated into another plane of the space-time continuum. I could feel the ship falling when I finally worked my hands free of the rope. I hadn't been tied long enough for the cords to interfere with my circulation. I headed for Blake's room. In 2 minutes we were on our way to the control cabin. Caldwell didn't see us till we had him. Blake grabbed his gun, I hauled him out of the control chair with one mighty heave, and dumped him onto the floor. He lay there, unresisting, grinning up at us. "Too late," he taunted. "We're approaching the first point of intolerance, and there's nothing you can do except prepare for the shock." I scarcely heard him. I plumped myself into the chair, and glared into the viewing plates. Nothing showed. That stumped me for a second. Then I saw the recorder. Instruments. They were trembling furiously, registering a body of infinite size. For one long moment I stared crazily at those incredible figures. Then plunged the decelerator far over. Before that pressure of fold-driven Adelitic Nander, the machine grew rigid. I had a sudden fantastic picture of two irresistible forces in full collision. Gasping, I jerked the power out of gear. We were still falling. "An orbit," Blake was saying. "Get us into an orbit." With shaking fingers, I pounded one out on the keyboard, basing my figures on a sun of soulish size, gravity and mass. The Bachelor wouldn't let us have it. I tried another orbit, and a third, and more, finally one that would have given us an orbit around mighty Antares itself. But the deadly reality remained. The ship plunged on, down and down. And there was nothing visible on the plates, not a real shadow of substance. It seemed to me once that I could make out a vague blur of greater darkness against the black reaches of space. But the stars were few in every direction and it was impossible to be sure. Finally, in despair, I whirled out of the seat, and knelt beside Caldwell, who was still making no effort to get up. "Listen, Jim," I pleaded, "what did you do this for? What's going to happen?" He was smiling easily. "Think," he said, "of an old, crusty, human bachelor. He maintains a relationship with his fellows, But the association is as remote as that which exists between a bachelor sun and the stars in the galaxy of which it is a part. He added. Any second now will strike the first period of intolerance. It works in jumps like quantum, each period being 498 years, 7 months and 8 days plus a few hours. It sounded like gibberish. But what's going to happen? I urged. For heaven's sake, man. He gazed up at me blandly, and looking up at him, I had the sudden, wondering realization that he was sane, the old, completely rational Jim Caldwell, made better somehow, stronger. He said quietly. Why, it'll just knock us out of its toleration area, and in doing so will put us back. Jerk. The lurch was immensely violent. With a bang, I struck the floor, skidded, and then a hand, Caldwells, caught me. And it was all over. I stood up, conscious that we were no longer falling. I looked at the instrument board. All the lights were dim, untroubled, the needles firmly at zero. I turned and stared at Caldwell, and at Blake, who was ruefully picking himself from the floor. Caldwell said persuasively. Let me at the control board, Bill. I want to set our course for Earth. For a long minute, I gazed at him, and then, slowly, I stepped aside. I stood by as he set the controls and pulled the accelerator over. Caldwell looked up. We'll reach Earth in about 8 hours, he said, and it'll be about a year and a half after we left 500 years ago. Something began to tug at the roof of my cranium. It took several seconds before I realized that it was my brain jumping with the tremendous understanding that suddenly flowed in upon me. The bachelor sun. I thought dazedly. In easing us out of field of toleration, it had simply precipitated us into a period of time beyond its field. Caldwell had said that it worked in jumps of 498 years and some 7 months and. But what about the ship? Wouldn't 27th century Adelaitignander brought to the 22nd century, before it was invented, change the course of history? I mumbled the question. Caldwell shook his head. Do we understand it? Do we even dare monkey with the raw power inside those engines? I'll say not. As for the ship, we'll keep it for our own private use. But, I began. He cut me off. Look, Bill, he said, here's the situation. That girl who kissed you, don't think I didn't see you falling like a ton of bricks, is going to be sitting beside you 50 years from now, when your voice from space reports to Earth that you had wakened on your first lap of the first trip to Centaurus. That's exactly what happened. The end.